there was an epidemic of them in the 1980s, and the mere making of an allegation could keep a father from seeing his children for some years while the matter wound its way through the system.
Welcome to Manosphere Highlights Daily. And shout out to Mr. Nicholas for sending this one in. Salute! This video comes from the YouTube channel The Other Side. And trust me, it's one of those rare moments when the mask slips and the truth comes straight from the inside. We're talking about a former Australian family court judge, Stuart Lindsay, who's pulling no punches. He talks effeminist ideology, political pressure, and how the family court system is flat out broken. His words, not ours. His experience from the inside. And the result? Men getting dragged, not because of justice, but because of an agenda. So in this one, we're letting them cook. Because when a former judge starts speaking like this, you shut up, you listen, you take notes. Then, at the end, I'll break it all down and add a bit of extra spice, especially when it comes to the corruption he's pointing at. Let's get into it. Now it's time for us to get into this and do what we gotta do. Because we men, ain't we? We men, ain't we?
Okay, this next story is a biggie. In an extraordinarily candid interview, a former Australian family court judge has spoken openly about the influence of feminist ideology and indirect political pressure on the court. This interview was conducted and posted this week online by respected men's rights campaigner, friend of The Other Side, and journalist Bettina Arndt. While highly respectful of the court and the judges who work in it, Adelaide barrister and former family court judge Stuart Lindsay told Bettina that our country's family court system is in enormous trouble. He says the problem isn't on the bench as much as in the Family Law Act, the laws themselves that the judges are required to follow.
The court is a hated institution in many people's view, having a real bias against men. Do you think that's fair?
Look, there are very good people in the court, very good judges sitting in the court doing a conscientious job, and not only judges, but there are family consultants and people writing reports who are doing a fine job and doing it conscientiously and trying to do their best for both the litigants and especially the children in parenting cases. But it's fundamental matters about the structure of the court, and of course it's the reason we have a court is because there's something called the Family Law Act, and it's the Family Law Act that creates the real mischief.
Mr. Lindsay says the Family Law Act, the laws themselves, have been a political plaything for decades.
Politics brought it into existence under Lionel Murphy back in the 70s, and politics plays with it with every change of government. And so over that last 50 years, the Act, particularly the parenting provisions and the property division parts of the Family Law Act have changed and changed fairly distinctly with changes of government. And of course, mainly, you'd have to say, left-wing Labor governments.
Oh dear. Mr. Lindsay says that the Labor governments are more influenced by feminist doctrines.
More influenced, as they are, by feminist doctrines, particularly in the 80s and 90s, and there's been a recrudescence of that since about 2013 under the Gillard government and a particular Attorney General under the Gillard government. So judges do their best to cope with these things. They do their best to ignore them if they can, these ideological strictures that are baked into the Family Law Act. And they do the best they can. I've made many good friends in the court. I know that men and women sitting as judges in the court do their job conscientiously, but you've got to bear in mind the building, the superstructure is that Family Law Act, and it has contained and it's promoted great wickedness throughout Australian society now for 50 years.
Great wickedness. Wow. The great wickedness plays out primarily on fathers and men in the form of false sexual abuse allegations. Mr. Lindsay says there was a sudden tidal wave of sexual abuse allegations in the 1980s.
And the court was completely unprepared to deal with those kinds of matters, as was the other institutions. And sexual abuse matters were there was an epidemic of them in the 1980s, and the mere making of an allegation could keep a father from seeing his children for some years while the matter wound its way through the system.
That's former Family Court Judge Stuart Lindsay speaking to Bettina Arndt this week. Mr. Lindsay says that the psychologists and doctors who gave evidence in the 1980s against accused men also had their own professional issues.
Psychologists and doctors who gave evidence and provided reports in those matters, the methodology was primitive back in the 1980s, and it took some very brave psychologists and psychiatrists and doctors to clean that up. Great damage was done in the meantime. So we recovered from that. We had a Liberal government, John Howard's, who eventually got around to making some structural changes to the Family Law Act, and we had that, just to try and give an overview of it, we had that period under Darryl Williams when the so-called Family Law Reform Bill was introduced, and then at the end of Howard's government, as I say, with the Gillard government, and then Rudd, and then Gillard, and then even under Turnbull, Abbott didn't do a lot of fiddling with it. We find more and more, Part 7 of the Act, that's the part dealing with parenting, we find these strange ideological invocations inserted into the Act to try to ensure that judges have the right, or provide for the right outcome in accordance with the prevailing, invariably, feminist ideology.
Wow, he said the quiet part out loud. That's former Family Court Judge Stuart Lindsay bravely saying what needs to be said, what needs to be discussed, and what needs to be addressed and changed by our current crop of politicians. He makes it very clear in this interview that the problem is the feminist bureaucrats.
The personnel on the court might change and the Attorney Generals might change, but the bureaucracy, the Commonwealth bureaucracy, it continues on. And so it's really the bureaucrats who designed and assisted the politicians in writing and rewriting provisions of the Act to try and get specific outcomes. So, but it wasn't just feminism, of course. I can remember going to a conference in Sydney where we, 5 or 10 minutes in, the fellow I was sitting next to, we looked at each other and we were getting pure Gramscian communist evaluations of all of our social institutions, and of course we walked out. We weren't going to put up with that. But so it's not just the legislation. It's not just it's the way the court operates. It's that Commonwealth bureaucracy, and indeed it's gone further than that, Bettina. The rot's gone further. It's the law societies and even the bar associations in the various states who are enlisted to these ideological excursions.
That's former Family Court Judge Stuart Lindsay. He says the law societies and the bar associations used to be professional guilds and associations that were there to look after members. Now, he says, they've been co-opted into ideological fashions and trends. As an example of how the feminist ideology is playing out in court, Lindsay discusses the latest changes to the Family Law Act, new laws that were snuck through Parliament by Labor on the last sitting day last year, which give more of the marital assets to alleged victims of domestic violence. Mr. Lindsay says this sets judges an impossible task, requiring them to perform acts of political theatre, unquote, as they try to find evidence of the impact of domestic violence, scouring through decades of a marriage, trials needlessly extended, vastly more paperwork racking up the billable hours for expensive lawyers. What Mr. Lindsay says will be, quote, a huge waste of resources, unquote. And for the families concerned, the pain, the distress will be needlessly intensified. And the kids get affected. That's the most important thing. Lindsay also shares strong views on other key failings of the court, like the failure to enforce parenting orders and the lack of penalties for false allegations. It's exceptionally rare for a former judge to be brave enough to speak out against the legal and government machine like this, so please don't underestimate the significance and importance of this particular interview by Bettina Arndt. Bettina presented this interview to a number of our mainstream media, including the conservative mainstream media, and none of them wanted to follow the story this week. It is a story when a former Supreme Court judge speaks out so strongly against the establishment. So something's not right in our media setting either.
Now this is where I want to add my 2 cents, because Judge Stuart Lindsay is basically saying the quiet part out loud. Judges who want to do what's right, a lot of them can't. Not because they're cowards, but because there's pressure, real pressure, coming from the top down, and it gets darker. Check out this clip from Steve.
Well, it gets crazy because he and several other attorneys that have been fighting for cases like this and trying to, as they win each case, it sets a precedent and helps other people. I end up getting a message from somebody one weekend saying, your attorney's missing. And just a friend, a buddy of mine on Facebook, I go and look, and there's this poster that's being shared digitally and shared all across social media saying, yeah, he just went missing this weekend. And, oh yeah, now he's mysteriously dead. I am not even kidding. This sounds like something out of a, some novel like The Firm or something where lawyers are ending up dead. And 2 other attorneys over the last year and a half around that same time, one of which had been fighting similar cases like this, ended up dead from a hit and run that they never figured out who did it. Which all of that was incredibly disturbing. The attorney at that point, I had known him for years. He was engaged to be married. He had been married before. He was engaged to be married to another woman. And it was never officially determined what the cause of death was. A couple of people whispered about suicide. I had a very, very hard time believing in that.
Now let's keep it all the way real. People don't just disappear because of bad luck. When a man goes up against the system and starts winning, or worse, exposing it, he becomes a threat. And threats, the system neutralizes them. The easiest way, just call it a suicide, close the case, and move on. No questions, no autopsy headlines, just another tragic story. But here's what they never count on. People talk, friends notice, patterns emerge, and when you start connecting the dots, the picture isn't incompetence, it's design. Always follow the money, guys. Family court is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Divorce, custody, child support, it's all a machine. And every cog in that machine runs on conflict. The longer it drags, the more someone gets paid, and it's never the father. So when you ask, why does it feel like the system is against men? It's not just a feeling, it's a business model. And anyone trying to unplug from that matrix, or worse, expose it, ends up silenced one way or another. That's why what Judge Lindsay did is important. That's why videos like this matter, because the truth isn't going to come from the top. It's going to come from those who already paid the price and still decided to speak. Major salute to the other side for bringing this one to light, and salute to every man out there fighting a rigged game and still showing up. Like always,
Manosphere, we working. Protect yourself at all times. This video has officially been highlighted.